This isn't my story, it's my grandmother's. She told me this story after I shared an equally horrific tale of my own, which I will post here someday. Anyway, I figured I should tell you guys my grandmother's story, and it's part of the period in time where lots of southerners were migrating to the northern states looking for better work and pay. This actually took my grandmother to New York, and this is where she did some work as a seamstress, and this is actually where the story took place. I would also like to add that my grandma is very paranoid. I mean, she is even now, and she's very paranoid about people she doesn't really know and situations that she can't control. So this story came as a shock to me and kind of explains a little about why she might be so paranoid. It was also important for me to add that she does not and never has taken crap off anyone. She's about 5'9", had muscles in her 60s, and still rocks a crew car and could kick somebody if necessary. She's not a typical granny at all. So my grandma and her friend Judy worked down the street from each other. They were introduced by my grandma's boss and they hit it off pretty well and started hanging out frequently after work. My grandma said that one night they went to a bar and had a good old time. It's here that men approached them. There were two of them, one was tall, light-skinned, and the other was a shorter, dark-skinned man. Judy seemed to know them and seemed happy to see them. She introduced them to my grandma, so they all decided to hang out for the evening. After a while of drinking and having a good time in the bar, the men slowly started asking Judy if her beautiful friend would like to come back to their houses and continue the party. My grandma declined, as she's always been paranoid, and said the men were giving her creepy vibes all night. They were doing weird stuff like whispering to each other too. Judy wasn't paying any attention to this, giving the general creeper stare as well. It was really horrible for her. The shorter, darker man kept trying to touch my grandma's wrist and waist. She said that he was ugly as hell and that he really looked like a beagle or something. That's her own words, and he was very short, so she practically towered over him. At one point, he tried to hold her hand and my nan just pushed him straight off her. The tall man persists with the after party idea, saying they could go and play cards and dance or whatnot in the big house. He promised that others would be there and they would just play cards. Judy at the time was thanking the men and they had her convinced, but she didn't want to go without my grandma. She then proceeded to beg my grandma to come with her. She tells my grandma to stop being paranoid and just trust her, that these guys are friends and it's okay. So my grandma is against the better judgment and left with them. My grandma says that she drove for a good while, and at the moment she looked out of the car window and didn't recognise anything at all. She then asked the tall guy where they're going, and he just said upstate. She knew she was probably in trouble. The two men sat in front and her and Judy were in the back. Judy's just telling my grandma to chill out, they're gonna have a good time. So they get there and it turns out the guys didn't lie. They pull up in front of a nice house in the suburbs. They go inside and my grandma always remembers the front door led them into a long, dimly lit hallway. They're all walking single file down the hallway in this order: tall man, Judy, grandma, short man. She said that at the end of the hallway there was a door which they wanted to go through, and apparently the tall man had to stop to open the door with a key. My grandma said that she saw a big rat in the spare room and it ran across a dirty mattress with some horrible stains on it. She says that this is what initially creeped her out about the house. The stains look like dried blood. Apparently they're waiting for the tall man to open the door, and my grandma is like 2 seconds away from bolting out of there when he finally opens the door. This is when the story gets creepy as hell. My grandma said she barely got a glimpse into the room. The door is pulled open towards him and she can see through the crack in between the door and its hinges in the frame, and it really looks weird. There were lots of women in nude, and there was all kinds of weird stuff laid about the floor. She could hear somebody screaming. My grandma says that she tried to turn and run, knocking the short man down in the process. My grandma says she was so much taller than him that she barely noticed him when running him over. Apparently the taller man had actually already grabbed Judy, who is now screaming too, with the help of another man. They actually shoved her into the other room and slammed the door shut, then turned to help the short man chase her down. She said she could hear them behind her yelling to catch that idiot, and that they would kill her when they catch her. She finally managed to get down the hall and out of the door, and from there she ran to the street screaming because she didn't know where she was or where a train station was or anything. She ran into a little old man who was opening a newsstand by the grace of God. He asked her what was going on, and she quickly pointed at the men, and he pulled out a huge gun and started yelling at them to go away and back off. They immediately got out of there. The newsstand man then helped her find a train station and gave her money to get back to the city. My grandma never saw Judy again, so my grandma had very narrowly avoided being abducted into a human trafficking ring. This experience took place 5 years ago. The whole experience is burned pretty intensely in my mind, so I remember about 90% of it pretty well. I'm a 26-year-old man, making me about 21 when this event occurred. So I live in Southern Ohio. I went to a smaller college in the area, and I was pretty isolated from most of my friends and family during the week. My friends all went to their various choices of college throughout the Midwest, and my family remained in my hometown. I ended up at a school alone because I had a rather specific major that was only offered by very few colleges in the country. Luckily, my girlfriend went to a college fairly close to mine, so I'd often find myself making 2 or 3 trips a week to see her. So on most of the weekends, I would go on a road trip to go and visit my friends at their campuses, which were a lot bigger and more fun. During this particular week in question, I was getting ready to make about a 2-hour trip to see my friend Carl at his school. I had probably made this trip about 30 times by now, so I knew the route pretty well and didn't even have to use a GPS to get there. I left on Friday afternoon once I was done with classes for the day, and I was set to arrive in Carl's dorm at about 8 PM, right on the time to go out for college drinking. I set off at about 5:50 and was roughly 15 minutes into my trip when my girlfriend called me. I thought that was pretty weird because she already knew that I was going to drive to Kyle's, so I quickly answered thinking something wasn't right. She was working that night and her car had broken down in a dorm parking lot when she was leaving to go to her work shift. She figured I wasn't too far into my road trip and wanted to know if I could give her a quick ride to work because I hadn't gone that too far from where she was. I did agree to go and see her as I was only about 20 minutes away. I was already pretty far off campus, so I pulled over my car on the highway and used the GPS to see if there was a faster way to get to her. The map did reveal that there was a side street coming up that I could use to get to her fairly quickly, so I told her that I was on my way and set off towards my new destination. I had seen the exit in question plenty of times, but I'd never had any reason to get off onto it, so once I exited the surrounding highways, it was completely unfamiliar to me. The exit that actually took me off onto had thick forest on both sides of the road. My phone informed me that my next exit wasn't for about 5 miles, so I had a long way to go before I could actually do any more navigating. About half a mile later, the road had turned and there were now long trees on either side of me. To be honest, it was really lovely. It was October, so the surrounding woods were a mixture of various warm colours and I was really enjoying it. The entire area was wooded on either side, with only the occasional break in the tree line for a driveway or a mailbox to poke out of. The houses were pretty hard to see through the tree line, but every so often I figured out where I was going and the houses were really nice looking. It was getting pretty dark and I had about a mile to go before I had to turn when I noticed a Toyota with the hood popped up further down the road. As I approached, I noticed that there was a man in a shirt and a tie with his head under the hood, seemingly with his broken down car. There was no traffic as far as I could see, so I stopped for a moment to ask if he needed anything and if he was okay. He obviously didn't hear what I was saying the first time, so I repeated myself even louder. "Everything okay?" This time he seemed to have heard me and lifted his head up a little bit from the engine and looked at me. Now this guy seemed completely normal, and he had a normal face to match. The best way to describe him was he was just pedestrian looking. He had short brown hair, brown eyes, and a 5 o'clock shadow. He smiled at me and said that he was on his way home from work and something had gone wrong with his engine. I offered him my phone in case he wanted to call anybody to get picked up or have the car towed. He replied, "Oh no, that's okay. I have a car service that's coming for me." They're probably closed until the morning, so I hate to ask, but can you give me a ride to my brother's house? He's only like 5 minutes away. This should have been an immediate red flag for me, but I was a little stunned by how normal this guy seemed, considering most hitchhikers on TV are crazy axe murderers. Now, it didn't make sense why he couldn't have used my phone to call his brother. Why didn't he do that? I guess I wasn't really thinking clearly at the time. Now, I was physically much bigger than him, and he was driving a nice car, so I figured that he wasn't a weirdo, or was maybe just a local person who was actually being genuine to me. So I did agree to give him a quick ride back to his brother's house since it was on my way to my girlfriend's. I unlocked the door for him to get in, and he pointed me in the direction of his brother's house, and we set off. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to go normal. I thought maybe I did the right thing. Then, things started to get weird. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was the way that he acted every time that there was a swear word in the music I was listening to. He flinched every time that 50 said a swear word. I picked up on it pretty quickly, so I changed the song thinking that he was just really against cursing or something. About a minute after I changed the song, he reached up and slammed his head onto the radio's power button to turn it off. Like you do. It wasn't crazy hard or anything, but it was definitely enough to get me to notice. I tried to make light of the situation and said, "Not your style." This question was met with complete silence. At this point, I was ready for this guy to get out of my car, so I asked, "How much further do we have to go?" "I have to be somewhere soon and I can't be late," I explained to him. He said that we had about 4 minutes to go, which kind of scared me because he said we were really close about 10 minutes ago now. I decided that maybe he was dangerous, but we were so close to the destination I could just let him out and he could just walk the rest of the distance maybe. It was getting late and I wasn't trying to face my girlfriend's wrath, so I told him that this was as far as I could go and that he'd have to walk the rest of the way. His mood immediately changed, but instead of getting angry, which I thought he would, he became panicky and practically begged me to take him the rest of the way. His overreaction set off alarms in my head, so I told him that he had to remove himself from my car because I was going to do it otherwise. He then pulled out his wallet, which was really oversized. He offered to pay me the rest of the way and he was going to give me $20 to get there, but when he did that, something fell out next to him. It was only a split second before he grabbed it and shoved it back into his pocket, but it haunts me to this day. Along with his money, there was a small Ziploc bag of what I'm confident were adult teeth from his wallet. Front teeth, molars, you name it. Ever since I've told this story, everybody's been skeptical to this part, but I'm confident in what I saw. I freaked out worse than I ever had before and screamed at him to get out of my car. He immediately got out and was looking back at me with really shocked looking eyes as if I'd done something wrong to him. I took off and the police simply told me that I should never pick up hitchhikers again and they weren't going to do anything because he didn't do any crimes. I don't know where he was going or what he was doing, but I'm pretty sure that I don't want to know. I do know, however, that he seemed to have every one of his teeth in his mouth. I don't know whose teeth they were or why he had them. I just hope nobody else has to encounter him. When I was 16, I was very involved in dance. I took classes at my local studio at around 6ish. The classes lasted around 2 hours and was located at an area known to be populated by gangs. I got out of class at about 2.5 hours later that night. The studio started to close and I was waiting on a bench outside. I had already texted my dad to come and collect me and I just stared ahead for about another 20 minutes. By then, everybody on the road was gone. It was then that I noticed somebody directly across the street from me. It was hard to see his face, but he seemed like he was 20 something. Now I know that something was off, and nobody expected to see people around at this time. It didn't make sense. I'd never seen anybody else out here. Although I was kind of weirded out by him, I just brushed it off and continued to look at the ground. While I was looking at him from the corner of my eye, I realised that he walked right by me. Now I wouldn't have been scared at this point, but he just started standing and didn't move again, staring directly at me. I looked up at him, and it was at this point that he decided to come walking across the street towards me. My heart started beating really quick at this point, and I stood up next to the bench and started walking away. He smiled and started sprinting towards me, screaming, "Come back here, girl, come back here right now." I was crying and running as fast as I could while he slowly started gaining on me. He was still screaming while I suddenly saw my dad's car pull up. He quickly got out of the car and yelled at the guy. He brought out the baseball bat from his car and started going towards the guy, and he slowly backed away and sprinted off. I'm just so glad that my dad was actually there at that exact moment, or else I don't know what could have happened to me. I was living with my stepsister in a small apartment, and we both worked night shifts. I usually got home only a few hours before she did. I had just gotten home and there was suddenly a loud knock at the door. I didn't recognise the guy through the peephole, but assumed it was one of her friends and opened the door to let him know that she was still at work. He surprised me when he said that he was there to see me. Apparently this guy was from only a few doors up, and he wanted to know if I played guitar because he had seen me carrying my guitar from my car. I said I did. It was very apparent at this point that the guy was very drunk. He said he'd be willing to pay if I would actually play for him. I knew it was a bad idea, but I didn't know what to say, so I said sure. He came inside and locked the door behind him. Not the greatest sign, but this was already not going well. He tried to follow me into my bedroom as I went to get my guitar, but I managed to tell him just to sit on the couch in the living room, and that way he'd be more comfortable. I played a song or two and he actually started crying and said that I had the voice of an angel. He wanted to play a song for me if that was okay. I said sure, but he was fumbling around with it and didn't really seem to know how to play. He assured me that the problem was a guitar. He said that he was used to electric. He said that he used to be the lead guitarist for Metallica actually, but left shortly before they become famous. In fact, most of their songs were originally his and they stole them. Of course I didn't believe a word of it, but I just pretended that I understood and nodded like I was going along with it. He wanted to prove to me that he was actually a really good guitar player and asked me to come over to his place, so that way I could watch him play electric guitar. Again, I knew it was an awful idea. It was bad enough letting some drunk stranger here, but leaving with him would even be worse. He insisted, and I didn't know how to refuse. His place was a mess. He couldn't find his guitar, then he said that he forgot it and sold it a long time ago. He offered to put the newest Star Wars movie on and go and find some beers. I said that's fine, so he put on the movie and said some stuff about how his family was involved in filming it. His claims were getting truly ridiculous. About 20 minutes into the movie, he told me that he had something to confess. Apparently every single night the dark side would go over to him and it would talk to him. He said that Satan kept telling him to kill me. He started trying again because he said that he didn't want to kill me because I was so nice and probably an angel. He said that Satan would soon take over his body, so I had to leave if I wanted to survive. I was more than fine with that, so I got up to go, but before I went to the door he asked me to wait because he wanted to give me a gift. He said it was an ancient coin that had been in his family for generations and probably is worth $1 million by now. So he puts it in my hand and closes it. He then spoke some gibberish and then started crying and screamed at me to run. This was more than a big enough cue for me to get out of there. When I was out, I decided to look at it and it was just a normal silver dollar from 1972. I still have it actually. I feel like I should have called the police or done something about what happened, but I didn't. About a year ago, I was driving home from a fairly popular shopping area in this town over from mine. It was early in the afternoon, the sun was out and the roads were crowded. I was driving on a narrow road, one lane in each direction, when a car suddenly comes up on my tail at high speed. There weren't any shoulders to pull off towards with oncoming traffic in the next lanes, so I really didn't have any option other than just to keep going. I could see the woman behind me in the car growling as she was getting very irritated with me, and I don't know why she was like this. Eventually we reached a stoplight. It felt like an eternity to wait for it to turn green. The entire time I watched her through my rearview mirror and she was just screaming at me. When the light finally turned, I made a left, as did my new friend. She kept getting closer and closer to my tail, which actually forced me to drive a lot quicker. This road was unfamiliar to me, and I really didn't like being on here. There was actually a large UPS coming up near us. The centre was on the other side of the road from me and had a very big parking lot. The woman, who at this point was trying to get her car onto the sidewalk in an attempt to pass me, saw this was an opportunity to finally get in front. She drove into the parking lot only to be stopped by a truck that was pulling out. I kept driving and eventually she pulled back onto the main road and was back behind me. We were driving towards another spotlight and I dreaded getting stuck there again. I stopped behind a few other cars at the light and she pulled up in the left-hand lane next to me. She then reached out towards the passenger side seat and reached out for something on her lap. She then reached back over and pulled out a gas canister. She was screaming at me, saying she's going to set me on fire. She started shaking the canister towards my car. I really didn't have anywhere to go at this point, and there were cars both in front and behind me, and I knew that getting out and starting a foot chase would be really stupid, so I called my dad and asked if this qualified as a reason to call the cops. In hindsight it obviously was, but at this point I had a lady with something unknown in her lap pouring gas onto my car, screaming the lighter was coming next. The light finally changed and she drove off. As she did, she held up what looked like a gun. I'm presuming that was the thing on her lap. Though it may have not been what it looked like waved at me, I decided to quickly pull up into the UPS parking lot and called the police. I never heard anything again since, but I still to this day have no idea why she was so angry at me or why she wanted to kill me. I was working 12-hour overnights in a nursing home. I was on the general unit that night and a resident was close to death. I got reported when I arrived at around 6 PM that Mary had visitors and that she was very close to dying and that she probably wouldn't make it the night. Apparently Mary also had lots of visitors coming to her. Unfortunately this was very common. Residents lived with us for literally years and we would never see a single family member going to see them. That was up until they were about to die. And the residents who were here would actually have to pay about $8,000 or $10,000 a month just for the higher nursing care. The rooms looked like Hilton suites. When somebody was close to death, family members would crawl out of woodworks to prove how much they loved their grandma and all of that crap. Mary actually lived with us for 4 years and I honestly didn't even know that she had family. I went to meet the family and there was a son and a grandson sitting in the room and a little great granddaughter who was playing around in the corridor. The adults sat in Mary's room sleeping or playing on their laptops and let the little girl run wild. Great. The little girl was not afraid of the elderly at all. I first caught her standing in another resident's room. She was stroking the face of an elderly woman. I thought it was sweet that she was visiting other residents, but I had to tell her to leave. As I was in there, she told me that she liked the way their skin feels as she left. Okay, so this kid is a little weird. She goes back to Mary's room and I go about my duties. I don't see that kid for a while and it's also super late and I assume they took her home. At about 1 AM, I come out to the medication room and I see this kid standing in the hallway alone. She's staring into another resident's room but not going in. I'm really annoyed at the family this time. Why are they letting her do this all by herself? As I walk up to her, before I can say anything, she turns and smiles at me and says, "Do you like to touch him?" I then completely forgotten what I was doing and what I was about to tell her, and I just said, "What do you mean?" "The old people, do you like touching them when they're dead?" I don't even know what to say at this point. It's dark and this kid is creepy. She's way too interested in all of this and there's something dead wrong about this. When I don't reply, she says, Does their skin feel different once they're not alive? Not knowing what to say to the smiling kid who asks if touching the dead is a good thing, I just tell her to go back to her great-grandma's room. She glares at me and looks angrier, and she looks angrier than I've ever seen a kid before. Now, Mary died at about 4 AM. I did not see that little kid again, but I was afraid that I would see her rubbing Mary's skin. Now, the son and grandson had actually left before the funeral home come to take away the body, but I didn't see the little girl leave with them. I assumed that she had been taken home after our enlightening chat about how dead people felt. It really gave me the creeps that I never saw her leave. I kept on checking over my shoulder expecting to see her. The next morning, I told the day shift nurse about how creepy this girl was. She told me, "I'm glad she wasn't here on my shift. I just had the son and grandson." Now, she was almost certain that the little girl was not on her shift. I guess she must have arrived after my shift started. Now, it was while on my drive home that I realised that I had not seen anybody else interact with that kid all night except for me. I never saw anybody talk to her, and I never actually saw her walk into Mary's room. I also did not confront her family about the kid's actions, but I did not want to seem rude, and I wasn't really sure what to do. The family had never mentioned that kid at any time that I was in the room during Mary's care. Even the resident she was touching at the start of my shift never actually woke up. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Every single night from then on, I've always checked over my shoulder expecting to see that creepy little girl there. On a rainy night in the era before cell phones, I was 18, walking a very long way from home. I foolishly accepted a ride home from a stranger. He was elderly and acted genuinely concerned for me. I saw a Bible in his back seat. Probably safe, right? The car was old and broken down, and he had to get out to open the door for me. Now, this in itself actually took a while because he had a dodgy leg. He told me the passenger door wouldn't open from the inside. I immediately felt weird, but years of nice girl training told me, oh, he's gone to way too much trouble now to say no. We chatted for a while and he politely complimented my uniform, my hair, and then he later told me that I looked a lot like his wife did, and that her spirit must have led him to help me get home. It sounded very nice the way he told me. The conversation started getting a bit more weird. He asked me if I was still in school and what my hobbies were. The questions continued getting stranger. He was just acting really weird to me. He said to me if I was fertile and that if I was, we should try and start a family. He then went on to tell me that God had left him lonely for all these years, but now, because I looked so much like his wife, it was clear I was meant to be his, so that way his life could start again and finally have lots of children like his wife couldn't do. He then grabbed my hand and kissed it and said, "I can't wait to show you our new bed." I told him I forgot something at work and he told me I could get it tomorrow. I told him that I had to pee and that I couldn't hold it in, and I said that I had to get out, but he wouldn't do anything. He kept talking about how things were different back then, and how men were the head of the household and that women are to follow their fathers and their husbands. I then thinking tried to blur out that you're going to get my father's permission to marry me before taking me to your home, right? God would want that. Right, you need that because otherwise you would be living in sin, and that's a marriage that is not holy. He then got offended and said that he knew the Bible better than me. I then told him that we could not live together in sin and we should go to my house before going home, and I reminded him that the street wasn't that far. Still trying to keep the conversation light and joking, I told him that's what a godly guy would do, and he wholeheartedly agreed. Then we get to the street where I'd previously told him that I lived. Of course I gave him a fake house address, one that was far from mine, and he had dropped me off there. He wanted to come inside. I told him that I needed to let my parents know about God sending me a husband before we could meet. I said it would take a few days and come back tomorrow. He said I'll give you a few minutes, but then we need to be on our way. I told him to drive around the block so I could go and get some time to pack my clothes, and he nodded and finally closed the door. I ran to the house's door, waited until he drove away, and then sprinted to my house where I lived alone, and then quickly deadbolted the door and put the couch in front of it that night. I never saw him again. I never called the police, but God, I wish I did. This happened when I was around 10 years old. I'm female and I had a golden retriever husky mix called Coda. He was around 6 months old and I loved him. I would actually run home from school every day so that way I could play with him before I had to start my homework. So one day, when my mum was driving me to this badminton class, she says that she forgot to pick up an important package from her boss and had to stop really quickly. We had to stop in a local post office immediately after. As we were there, she parked in an empty space before running off. I sat in the back row with Coda. The window was slightly open as my mum didn't want us to suffocate. You could probably fit an arm in there, so we're just sitting there and I'm talking with Coda about my friends and whatever a 9-year-old says to a dog. So as I'm just sitting there talking, I suddenly see a hooded homeless man who looks like he's been homeless for many years. He was dirty and had very nasty hair. He knocks on the window and says, "Is your mother here?" I get kind of nervous and smartly say, "Yeah." He goes, "Where is she?" I get kind of suspicious because Coda starts growling at him and barking. He never does this normally. I say, "Well, she's coming back any moment, but probably not now." There was some tension for a second or two. He suddenly sticks his arm through the window and has a large knife. I throw myself to the other side of the seat while shrieking. He's lunging and stabbing, trying to get him further. Coda leaps up and sinks his teeth into his arm and bites out a big chunk of meat. The man loses it, and I can see a hole in his jacket with blood pouring out from it. He quickly recoils back in fear and horror. I can see how much pain he's in. He drops his knife as his hand hits the top part of the door. I stopped crying for a second and picked up the knife. As I did so and he realised that the dog was still there, he quickly ran off and I couldn't see him after that. I threw the knife out of the window. My mum then returns and sees the blood on the door and I quickly started telling her what happened. She called the police and tried to describe the suspect as best she could, but they never found him. I recently went on a hike with my friend and his dog at a local state park. We'd gone on this trail several times before. It's very popular with hikers and families. It was late in the evening and getting dark, so we picked up the pace. Once it was dark enough to not be able to see where we were stepping, I turned on a little flashlight that my mum had given me just for that day. She had always worried about me walking to my car late after classes and whatnot, and told me that I had to shine it into somebody's faces if they were being creepy, which I thought was silly. Bringing this flashlight was a total fluke, but I was happy to have it to guide us. So by this point we were about 10 minutes away from the edge of the forest where we had parked, and we encountered a lone adult who was walking along the same direction as us about 100 yards ahead. Now this guy was a Caucasian in his mid-50s wearing non-hiking clothes. He was slowly walking, which was very odd because it was very dark and most hikers were actually trying to get out of here quickly. They would all be hurrying out of the woods. This man didn't even have a flashlight in the very dark forest. Now my finger slipped from the flashlight and turned it off for a few seconds. I turned it back on and the man had stopped walking and was staring at us in the path ahead. He quickly moved to the side as soon as I turned the light back on and said that he was doing something with his cell phone. We continued towards him. As we walked by the man standing on the side of the path, our normal friendly dog barked and growled at the man. The only words we heard the man say were, "Oh, she's an ankle biter." He was suddenly not talking on his phone. I shined the flashlight in his direction for a while and we walked by. Now the woods were extremely dark. I had a really weird feeling about him and started jogging away with my friend, and eventually we ran out of the woods. As we were getting back in the car, we saw the exact same man exit the woods maybe a minute after us. He was walking quickly towards us and we had to quickly get to our car. Now he had to be running because we ran the whole way back out of the woods, and this guy was significantly older than us, so he would have required a lot of effort to run that quick. When we got into the car, the man quickly approached us. I told my friend to floor it and we got out of there. Now I still don't know who this guy was or what he wanted. I just hope that I don't see him in these woods again, especially not alone. This is not my story, but my father's. This happened in the summer of 1993. My dad and his girlfriend, who's now my stepmother, were living in Cardiff, Wales in the city centre. It's not exactly an area that gets a lot of crime. So to the story. It's 6 AM and my dad goes down to get his morning coffee. As he walks into the kitchen, he is welcomed by a random man sat at the kitchen table just staring at him. Being the cool guy he is, instead of freaking out, my dad asks if he wants a cup of coffee. The intruder then joins him. A few minutes later, my dad's girlfriend also comes in, and instead of freaking out, offers to make him some breakfast. So the three of them sit down, have breakfast and chat for 20 minutes or so. Apparently their conversation was weird, but not really scary. They finish breakfast and eventually escort this guy through the front door. After the guy had left, they started freaking out. Turns out the guy was a paranoid schizophrenic who broke into multiple houses. My dad's was the second one. The next door guy whose house he went into first was actually empty. This is actually where the guy decided to leave all of his tools. He had a sawn-off shotgun and a lot of ammo. His plan was to shoot anybody in the odd-numbered houses on the street. When the police arrested him, he told them that my dad and his girlfriend were the nicest people he'd ever met and that actually stopped him carrying out his plan.